It is May 19th, Monday, May 19th, 2025. Mark Kulak, Kusonic.live. And I'm just calling this one Wuhan Coverup VS Germs. I'm sure people have heard of the Wuhan Coverup book. And there it is. There's in all its glory, the Wuhan Coverup and the terrifying bioweapons arms race by current United States Health and Human Services, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This book came out last year, the year before. So given the fact that the terrifying bioweapons arms race is in the title, this is a book that should be talking a lot about biological terrorism. Right? I mean, I'm going to step out on a limb, okay? So I would expect that this book should extensively reference one of the most important biowarfare books in the last 100 years, easily, and that's the 2001 Judith Miller Germs book. As a matter of fact, I would expect, and I think it's safely for us to expect, that many of the same people that this book talks about, the 2001 Judith Miller, Stephen Engelberg, William Broad book, the book that was published, made available for sale and purchased on September 7th or 9th of 2001, that weekend before September 11th, these guys were actually in the New York Times. They were on TV, Good Morning America, something like that. There was already a PBS, Public Broadcasting System, Nova show being made to highlight the book. It was all there. And as we've been showing in this, the longest and probably the most important series I've done in my program, 6 years, this 280 series, this narration of and the deep dive of the Germs book, this book should cover many topics which are repeated and reiterated in the Wuhan Coverup, assuming the Wuhan Coverup is worth its salt, okay? So first thing I'm going to search for is, this is Amazon Kindle. I can search for Miller. So I'm just curious, does it even mention the name Judith Miller? Okay, I see one mention here on page 154. Particular Jerry Hauer, so it does mention Jerry Hauer, okay, and Judith Miller. So it does mention the author of the Germs book. It does mention Jerome Hauer. Okay, that's good. So as you can see, there's a little bit of crossover here. Now, it just says that Judith Miller was on the TV shows, says, and this was on page, and again, it doesn't map that well, the electronic book, because it's always going to be readjusting what shows up on which electronic page. But it says, over the next 2 months, and this is from the Wuhan Coverup book, the participants of the simulation, particularly Jerome Hauer and Judith Miller's, mounted far-reaching filibusters on the Sunday morning talk show circuit, warning Americans about an impending biological attack and pointing their fingers at Saddam Hussein. Exactly. Matter of fact, the Wuhan Coverup book here is telling us that Judith Miller and Jerry Hauer were telling us about the possibility of a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center before September 11th, 2001. Isn't it remarkable that this book about that, which deep dives in it, came out on September 7th or 9th of 2001? That's amazing. So here, the Dark Winter simulation combined with Hauer and Miller's barnstorming crusade were so successful in generating media attention that they prompted highly publicized hearings by two separate Senate committees. The Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee covered the first of the hearings, the threat of bioterrorism and the spread of infectious diseases, 6 days before 9/11. Well, why don't they say that the person who was there, or I should say had his letter read there to then head of the Foreign Relations Subcommittee, Joe Biden, was Joshua Lederberg. As a matter of fact, if I get on the book here, the Germs book, and if I do a search, somehow Joshua Lederberg is not mentioned once in the Wuhan Coverup book and its review of the history of biological warfare. Not one mention of William Hazeltine, not one mention in the Wuhan Coverup book. How much of a deep dive on the history of bioterror can the Wuhan Coverup be if it doesn't mention Hazeltine, if it doesn't mention Lederberg? Wow, and not one mention of Monath. Wow, we have to just make a list here, okay? No Monath, no Lederberg, No Hazeltine. By the way, I have checked on some of these before. I wanted to make sure that this particular episode would be worth doing. So I had some ideas ahead of time about what it wouldn't mention. What about Andrew Weber? You know, the big character with respect to collecting all these biological weapons, going to Ukraine in 2005, which of course was after this book, and finding the anthrax and shaking the anthrax vial in front of Barack Obama. What Andrew Weber has to be in this book, right? Wow. Nope. So Andrew Weber is also not in the book. Wow. Okay, I know. Richard Preston. Richard Preston wrote the Cobra event. Richard Preston wrote Hot Zone Anthrax. Richard Preston tells us that what's going on here is humans taking control of their own evolution. He said that on the Charlie Rose Show in the year 2000. What about Richard Preston? Is he in the Wuhan Coverup book? No. Richard Preston, Andrew Weber, William Hazeltine, Joshua Lederberg, Thomas Monath. Amongst the most important people you need to know to understand the history of at least the last 25, 30 years of bioterror, biowarfare research in the United States are all missing from the Wuhan Coverup book. I'll probably make a title slide for this show, and I'm just going to list missing: Lederberg, Monath, Hazeltine, Weber, Preston. I also searched for David Hone. It's not in there, and Feldman. But, I mean, these are more recent names, and they're important with respect to Robert Malone, but I'm not going to get into it. What about Winburn? No mention of the Winburn Center. What is mentioned in this Wuhan Coverup book? If you search for Hamburg, it does have 4 references to Margaret Hamburg. 4. Because she was at the Dark Winter exercises. Only 4 references. That's very, very sad. In reality, she was only referenced twice in there. It does mention Nunn and Luger a little bit, but really not that much. I'm sure that Bioport is mentioned. Oh, yeah. They have to mention Bioport because the old anthrax vaccine is bad, right? And everyone involved in it is bad. I'll bet you Whitney Webb gets a few shout-outs, too. 2 more things. Okay, one is, how often is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency mentioned here? So DTRA has a total of 27 references, but DARPA has 72 references. So why does the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that has 2,700 employees have 27 references, and DARPA that only has 200 employees get 72 references? It's almost as if there's a bias here against DARPA. You ever notice that? There's a bias. It's all DARPA. Don't mention DITRA. I mean, sometimes you have to. You can't get away with it, but it's always DARPA. Does this book mention Galloway? Daryl Galloway is not mentioned. That's interesting because I thought Galloway was a relevant person. Robert Malone said in one of his recent interviews. Galloway does not get mentioned. SAIC is not mentioned. The anthrax vaccine, the other weaponized anthrax is not mentioned. What about Mark Zed? No, Mark Zed is not mentioned, even though he did work parallel with Merrill Nass. Mark Zed is not mentioned. One of Gelsinger's messengers. No, Jesse Gelsinger is not mentioned. Okay. So the one last thing I was going to show is the fake anti-vaccine hero, Andrew Wakefield, who came to the United States along with Peter Daszak, does get a mention in here. And it was actually in chapter 24. So chapter 24 says, in 1984, Peter Daszak attended University College of North Wales, Bangor, that's England, where he earned a degree in zoology, graduating in 1987. He completed his doctorate in parasitology from the University of East London in 1994, specializing in parasites that attack reptiles and amphibia. In 1997, he published a paper, ironically, co-authored with British gastroenterologist Dr. Andrew Wakefield. So, the Wuhan Coverup book does actually mention that Peter Daszak co-authored with Andrew Wakefield. Of course, they co-authored twice. It's not making mention of that. They did co-author twice. But was Peter Daszak, was he really it says he was a parasitologist and a zoologist. Let me go to my page on Daszak. Yeah, I guess it was a PhD in parasitic infectious diseases. Yeah, it was zoology. Yeah, 1994. But here's the Crohn disease after in utero measles exposure with Anders Ekbom, Peter Daszak. Again, because there's multiple papers, this is September 1996, with Wolfgang Kras and Andrew Wakefield. Here we see Peter Daszak is at Department of Life Sciences at Kingston University. So while Peter Daszak was, I guess he does have a degree in parasitology and or that's where his PhD and it was also zoology. He's doing this work. He actually joins the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Study Group, School of Life Sciences, Kingston University. I don't know why the book on Wuhan Coverup doesn't say that. I'm also noticing something concerning here. The book, Wuhan Coverup, says Daszak is the son of a Ukrainian former World War II British POW, Bohdan Zadak. As the war ended, he fled across Russian lines to escape Stalin. The British took him as a prisoner and sent him to the UK. There, British officials released him into the UK population, probably because deporting him to Ukraine. I feel like they kind of took some of my research there. I don't know. They have sources for it. I'm not going to dig into it too much. But I just kind of wanted to highlight, again, to review things that the Wuhan cover-up doesn't cover because it's a cover-up. It's a real cover-up. You write a cover-up book as part of the cover-up. Thomas Monath, Joshua Lederberg, William Hazeltine, Andrew Weber, and Richard Preston, anything Winber Lab related, Inovio Corporation, Daryl Galloway, SAIC, Mark Zad, Jesse Gelsinger, and Viscal. There's your Wuhan cover-up book. The Wuhan cover-up book does not cover some of the most important topics, which the real Bioterror book, which came out September 7th, 9th, 2001, does cover. I just thought you might find that interesting.